As a parent, are you exhausted from watching your child struggle with ADHD signs despite trying every traditional approach? Maybe you've sat through countless doctor's appointments and they've quickly diagnosed your child. They've prescribed a med. If that didn't work, they increased the dosage or tried a different brand. If that's the case, you're like many parents we see in our office, and you've probably felt frustrated because no doctor was really willing to discuss anything outside of medication. So, if you have now started to wonder, is there something more you can be doing for your child's long term success? That's what this video is about. Now, here's the deal. In the US, over 7 million children have been diagnosed with ADHD. Yet, the testing methods, the treatment methods are really about the same as they were 20 years ago. They're focused more on looking at the different signs and maybe categorizing, does your child have inattentive ADHD? Do they have hyperactive ADHD? Do they have a mixed combined approach or a combined diagnosis of them both? If that's the case, no one really is looking at the root, because what is going on below the surface? So in this video, I want to share with you what we do in our office instead of a neuropsych eval or maybe a more traditional test, how we actually measure your child's nervous system to see if we can get to the root of the problem. And I want to share with you two common patterns that we see on the neurological scans that we do that actually can help you better relate to your child to see, are they more of this revved up, we call a raging bull, or are they more disorganized, kind of drunken bull, we call it. And a lot of times those also relate to hyperactive versus inattentive. So before we dive in, I do want to share a quick story of little James. He came to see us in fifth grade and he was more the raging bull style. And I'll show you here these scans in just a moment. But there's a couple patterns that we're looking for in these scans, and he had definitely the raging bull pattern. So what this meant is that he was full of energy. He would frequently get fix-it tickets from his teacher because his energy was so high, he would become dysregulated, he would become hyperactive. If him and another classmate started to amp up, the teacher could see it spiral really quickly. Now, parents didn't want to medicate, they wanted to do something different. So they started with neurological focused chiropractic care. Fast forward a few months into care, and mom reported, guess what? Little James has actually gone a full month without a fix-it ticket. Instead of in the past, he was getting several a week. This happened not because we were treating ADHD, not because we were saying, oh, it's this category, we're going to do this one approach. What we did is looked below the surface. We helped his nervous system start to regulate internally, start to activate his brake pedal so his brain could start to feel more organized and more calm, even in a situation that would normally amp him up. So, as mentioned, there's two main categories that we see in our office. The most common, and let me bring that back up here, is what we call the raging bull. That's actually this one in the middle here. So this one, basically, we call it raging because there's so much energy in the body. And what happens is when there's lots of energy in the body that we can measure with this neurological scan, is it feeds energy into the brain. As a result, the brain has to do something with that energy, and that's where we see the typical kind of hyperactive symptoms. Not sitting still, always on the move, playing sports all day long, and still not being tired. Maybe they are feeling a little bit of energy come on and they can't like sit back down and regulate, but things constantly spiral out of control. If that's the case in that hyperactive category, a lot of times what we see, it's because not that the brain is the problem, even though the neuropsych eval you've taken or the pediatrician you've talked to said, yep, there's an imbalance in their brain chemistry, or we can actually measure changes in their brain. We know that's what's going on. What we look for in our office is actually what's feeding into the brain. So what we find is if the brain is getting stress from the body, now that actually starts to affect what we see in behaviors. So I want to explain this to you, and then I'll show the second category that we see. So a lot of times in the world of ADHD, we know that the prefrontal cortex can be affected. This is a common thing you'll hear in the research and the study, because here's executive functioning. This helps us sit still and focus and pay attention. And if the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, is working better, ADHD can start to go better. We also know that there's this part of the brain, the limbic area, that regulates emotions, memory, behaviors. And a lot of times this could be affected too. However, one of the keys that we see in our office is what is feeding in to these areas. Well, that is actually coming from a lower part of the brain called the cerebellum. This integrates movement and sensory experiences. So, what happens is information from the body is feeding into this part of the brain. And now this part of the brain starts to feed forward into the other areas. So, what happens is if there is stress in the body, it starts to feed stress into this cerebellum part of the brain. And now that says, okay, well, if I'm getting that as my input, I'm going to send messages of stress and movement and hyperactivity to the rest of the brain. So rather than saying, yes, we can measure the brain, that's where the problem is, we say, yeah, we can see that's happening in this part of the brain. Maybe it's a PFC, maybe it's other areas, but why is it happening? And that's what we love to test for with our scans. So going back to these scans, in little James' case, you can see again this middle pattern. He had a ton of energy. That's what all these red bars are, feeding stress into his brain. So that was coming into the brain. The only choice his brain had was to respond with stress and movement and hyperactivity as an output. The other category we see then is a more disorganized brain. We call it a drunken bull. This is a kiddo that potentially has been under stress for a while. So sometimes what we see is maybe a kiddo when they're young, that raging bull is maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, a little more common where they're just always on the move then. Later on, that inattentive ADHD diagnosis can often be accompanied with this more disorganized scan. So you might find your child is a little like spacey. You just see them daydreaming a lot. Maybe they're not quite as coordinated. Maybe they don't move as well. They don't like sports as much, but they love art and drawing. And that's one of the things, too, I want to take a quick disclaimer here is that a lot of times with ADHD, it can be perceived as a deficit. You notice them falling behind in school, you notice their self esteem struggling, you see meltdowns over homework, you see teachers reprimanding them or giving you a call, and you see more easily all the negatives. However, what we see in kiddos is because their brain is wired a little bit differently, they also see the world differently. Maybe they are incredibly creative. Maybe they can see the world in a different way. Maybe they're brilliant at art or clay or drawing or painting. In the case of like that raging bull, one of my mentors has a big raging bull brain. And once he started getting adjusted, he could actually harness that. In college, he started getting adjusted and he said, oh, I process the world really quickly with my raging bull brain. And now I can actually use it productively in the world. And he's really successful. There was a seventh grader that we saw, and he had a raging bull brain. And when he sat down in the office, I could tell he was like assessing things. And I asked him, I'm like, do you know what's going on in this room already? He's like, yeah, as soon as I sat down, I knew what that was for. I knew what that was for. I knew what that was for, right? Boom, boom, boom. Because his brain processes so quickly, it goes on to the next thing really quickly. So we didn't perceive it as a deficit. We said, all right, well, let's let you harness that so you can stay focused on one thing long enough and you're going to do really well. And he did. So ultimately, when we're looking at things then is going back to these scans is we're saying, all right, is there too much energy coming in? Is it a disorganized energy, maybe leading to that inattentive diagnosis? Maybe your kiddo's 12 and she just can't pay attention long enough to get through a test. Or when she tries to do homework at home, it leads to a meltdown and you're trying to help as a parent, but it just doesn't work because their brain just doesn't want to do it because it can't focus long enough. Or maybe it's a combination of both. It's hyperactive and inattentive. Regardless, when we can measure what's happening in the nervous system, we can now put a plan together to help. And that's what I love about these scans is they're very safe, very gentle, and they allow us to see inside your child's body. They allow us to see in the body rather than just the brain. Because when we can see what's happening inside the body, now what we can do is if there is stress coming from in the body, it's going to feed stress all the way up the line. However, if we can switch that and start to now put calm from the body into the brain, it starts to feel calm and organization up the line. And the brain itself actually starts to change. They've done research where they hook EEGs up to the brain, and they find that with a neurologically focused adjustment, on average, the prefrontal cortex improves its ability to process the world by 20%. So that's what we love helping kids with in our office, is really getting beyond a diagnosis, getting beyond the labels that's been put on them, and really start to help them thrive, to set them up for success, and to see their brain as a superhero brain, as a superpower brain, and really let them thrive and succeed in the world. So, if that is ever interesting for you, please reach out. If you're curious to know what your child's scans look like, we're here for you. Take a look at our website if you want to learn more. Give us a call, shoot us an email, and we'd be happy to help your child thrive.